Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, The Story Ain't Over. So as you can tell from the title of this video, I'm going to be telling you about the books that I read in January of 2022. This is actually a really great reading month for me. I tweeted about this earlier in the month, but I read maybe a total of 2 books in December of 2021, but I managed to read a total of 7 books in January, which is just insane for me in particular because, as many of you may know, I usually average about 4 or 5 books, if that, each month. Sometimes I don't read at all, sometimes I read like 2 books in the month. So me managing to read 7 books was actually quite a feat, and part of that was because my province was in lockdown for this month in Canada, so I had a lot of time at home to just read, which was both good and bad in ways. But yes, as I said, I read 7 books this month. They're all stacked here so you know what's to come. I'm going to be talking about them in the order that I read them. So starting with Keeper of Night by Kaikeyi Baker and then ending off with When We Left Cuba by Chanel Clayton. I am filming this a couple days before the end of the month, so I might squeeze in one more book, I think, before this month is over, but I'll talk about it in my February wrap up, if anything. And then aside from that, an overall look at the month, I found one of my new all-time favorite reads ever, and then another couple were just like great reads in general, and then 2 were slightly disappointing for me, which I'll sort of get into. They weren't like majorly disappointing, but just slightly disappointing for me in particular. But overall, I feel like I had a really great reading month. I enjoyed most of these books, and it was just a fun time to just like get through all these books. Okay, so the first book that I finished in January was, of course, The Keeper of Night by Kaikeyi Baker. I read this one for my December Patreon book club. I had meant to finish it in December, never got around to it. So I ended up finishing this in like the first couple days of January, and I actually did a live show discussing this book for my patrons. It's like an exclusive little event. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, go check out my Patreon. I'll leave the link down below. But Keeper of the Night I was interested in because it came as one of the books in the Book of the Month boxes for a previous month, I think in November or October. This basically follows our main character, Ren Scarborough, who is half a Japanese Shinigami and half a British Reaper. So she's a bit of a death god or Reaper in both cultures, but she currently lives in London with her dad's side of the family, the British side, and she has a younger brother and everything, and she's mostly been discriminated against because of her mixed race and all of that, and so she's having a terrible time. And when something sort of bad happens that she accidentally does, she decides that she's going to flee London and that she's going to go to Japan and sort of find the Shinigamis and try to find a home there and potentially also find her mother. She's never seen nor heard from her mother her entire life, and since she's this Reaper Shinigami person, she's lived for more than 100 years or something, which was also pretty interesting. And then from there, she sort of travels with her brother to Japan, and she's trying to rediscover this side of her family, and she ends up getting embroiled in the Shinigami side of things and meets some yokai, some different Japanese demons and that kind of thing. So those aspects were really, really interesting, and I think on paper this book just seemed really, really cool to me, and I was excited to pick it up. I think overall this one was a teeny bit of a letdown. I would rate it probably around 3-ish stars. I did enjoy it and I did find it intriguing. I felt the beginning was a little bit slow to start, but as I got deeper into it, I was interested in what was going to happen next. I really loved the yokai in this book and the different mythology that we got to see in this. But personally, I felt like the characterization and sort of character development of the main character was what was lacking for me. And also some of the world building, I felt like the entire book sort of worked in a bit of a silo. You couldn't really tell what time period we were in, which may have been an artistic choice, which is totally fine, but I just felt like I wanted it to be a little bit more grounded. I also felt really frustrated with some of the main character's decisions and things that she did, but she was also a cool character in a way. I think where she ends up at the end of the book is really quite interesting, and I did actually enjoy the ending. I just wish it had been developed a little bit more, and I think that was the consensus amongst all of us who were reading this for my Patreon of book club. We all felt like it could have just been developed a bit more and fleshed out a little bit more to make it work. So this one was an enjoyable read. I'm not 100% sure that I would pick up the next book, but I would be intrigued to see where it sort of goes, because there are some loose ends at the end of this book that I would be curious to see where they go. All right, the next book that I picked up in January was Iron Widow by Sharon J. Zhao, and this one was another Patreon book club pick for me. It was for our January book club, and I'm actually filming this video the day that we are about to do our live show as well, and I have an exclusive reading vlog of like spoilery thoughts on this also going up for them. And actually this was one of my 5-star predictions for 2022, one that I was convinced was going to be a 5-star read and like one of my new all-time favorites. So I vlogged the entire experience. So I'm hoping to like sort of do a full roundup of all the books that were on that video in like one giant vlog of like showing you how I felt while reading each one and sort of giving you a full overview of how those predictions turned out. So you can look forward to that, but if you want to see them like sort of early and get the full versions of them, you should definitely go check out my Patreon. Once again, linked below. But yeah, general thoughts on this, since I don't want to spoil too much of those videos that will eventually come out. This one definitely didn't live up quite to the expectations that I had for it. It was a 5-star prediction, as I said, and I don't think it quite hit there for me. If I had to rate it, it would probably be closer to like a 3.54, I would say. I did think it was very cool. It did deliver on some of the cool and interesting aspects. Basically, this follows our main character, Zetian, who is this 18-year-old girl living in this sort of East Asian, Chinese-inspired fantasy/sci-fi far future world, and their borders are basically attacked constantly by these things called Hunduns, which are sort of these like giant robot alien things from what I could tell. And so in order to fight these Hunduns, the Hoaxian sort of empire has created these things called chrysalis, which are these like giant mechanized robots, like super massive, and they're piloted by a man and a woman, and they're piloted using like internal energy called ki. But the interesting thing about this empire is that it's like very patriarchal and very like misogynistic as well. And so often the way that the chrysalis work is that the men will sort of pilot it, and then the girls end up being like a energy source that ends up getting like used up completely, and oftentimes these women die. And so our main character Zeti and her older sister went off to be one of these concubine pilots and ends up dying and killed by her male counterpart. And so Zetian is sort of filled with this like deep rage and has always hated sort of the patriarchal nature of her country. And so she ends up volunteering to become a concubine pilot in order to kill her sister's killer, and things sort of spiral from there. But I don't want to spoil too much for any of you who haven't read this one, but overall, that's like the general concept, and Zetian as a character was quite cool. I do feel like she was the type of character who was filled with all of these rageful thoughts and like had these ambitions and things she wanted to do, but I felt like she would make a lot of snap decisions, and it was sort of hard to see where her thought process was going. I feel like it just wasn't explained enough a lot of times. And while I really loved like the overall concept of this and like the feminist nature of this, and you know how much Zetian cared for like the other concubine pilots and wanting to save them and all of that, I did feel like the world building sort of fell a little bit flat for me, in the sense that like there was just so many unanswered questions that I was like, this doesn't really make sense, and I was sort of curious about those. Another aspect to this book is that there is a polyamorous relationship. It is like in a budding phase in this book, but I'm assuming it'll go further in the next book. But even that relationship, while I thought was cool and I liked the dynamic between the 3 characters, I just felt like the character motivations were kind of iffy. So overall, this ended up being more of a 3.54 star read for me. I definitely don't think it was a 5-star, but it was still really enjoyable. Like I still would recommend this to a lot of people. It was still a lot of fun, really cool, interesting world. Just didn't quite live up to the expectation that I had for it. All right, the next book is one that's probably one of my favorites on this list, and that is 6 Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. So this was our book club pick for January for the Read and Color book club, which is a free book club that I run here on my channel. We also do some discussion on an app called Fable. All the links are down below, including the announcement video. But the entire point of the book club is that we read books by BIPOC authors each month and sort of add a little bit of color to our lives and expand our reading horizons. So for January, we're reading 6 Crimson Cranes, and I believe this video will go up before my live show for this book, so I don't want to spoil too much of my thoughts. But overall, absolutely loved this book so much. It just blew my expectations out of the park. I went into this sort of warily expecting to enjoy it, but not expecting to love it. And it was just so perfect in so many ways. This book is meant to be sort of like a fairy tale and feel like a fairy tale, and I feel like it really delivered on that feeling. I felt like the entire time I was reading a fairy tale, and I was just sucked into the story and really loved the main character of this book. I think she was so endearing and just such a wonderful character to root for, and I just love seeing her character growth as well over the course of the book. So basically, for those of you who don't know what this book is about, it follows our main character Shiori, who lives in this sort of like fantasy kingdom world. It is inspired by East Asian folklore, but also by the fairy tale The Wild Swans by Hans Christian Andersen, I believe. So Shiori lives in this kingdom, and magic is sort of forbidden in her kingdom. And when Shiori sort of shows a bit of magic on the day of her betrothal, it catches the eye of her stepmother Raikama. And a few events unfold at the beginning of the book, which lead to Shiori learning something about Raikama, and Raikama in turn banishes Shiori from the kingdom and curses her to have this like bowl on her head. And as long as that bowl is on her head, for every word that she speaks, one of her brothers will die. And amid all of this, Raikama has also turned all of her brothers into cranes. So 6 crimson cranes, and they are cranes like during the day, and then at night they turn back into men, but they are unable to like approach their kingdom or like talk to their father, and Shiori is sort of forced to find a way to break this curse. And so it ends up being this like really long journey as she's trying to figure this out, and there are multiple characters involved and like other plots going on. And what I really loved about this also was just like how layered of a character Raikama was as like the villain in the story, and just overall there were so many things well done. I don't want to talk about intricate details for this one because I want to save that for the live show for this. I've also heard Elizabeth Lim's other YA fantasy series is also great. I think it's called Spin the Dawn. I really want to read that one now after reading this one because I was just blown away by this. It totally blew my expectations out of the park and was definitely like a 5-star read for me. Alrighty, the next book that I read in January was actually an ARC, or an advanced reader copy, of a book that is coming out in April of this year. And this was one of my most anticipated releases of 2022. I had like connected with the author on Twitter and somehow managed to get my hands on an early copy, and honestly it was the best thing ever because I ended up loving this book so much. And I kid you not when I say that this is my like new all-time favorite book ever. And that book is Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. I am always saying this word wrong, so I apologize for those of you who keep correcting me in the comments. I think I'm saying it right now, but I might be wrong still. So Kaikeyi follows the vilified queen from the Ramayana, which is this Hindu epic following one of the incarnations of the god Vishnu. And so in the myth and in the epic, Kaikeyi is a bit of a like evil queen, I would say. Some of her actions and the decisions that she makes directly like change the course of the story. And so oftentimes she's sort of portrayed in a bad light, but this book sort of takes her perspective from when she's a child and shows her entire life and sort of the events of the epic as well. And you get to see how she has reasons for the things that she does. And she also is just like a full-bodied person aside from being a side character in this man's story. This book is very much similar to Circe by Madeline Miller, if you've ever read that. I haven't read it yet, but I know a lot of people have been like comparing it to that because it's similar in sort of style. But this book honestly just blew me away. I knew I would probably enjoy it, but I didn't realize how much I would love it so much. It had so many great examinations of what it meant to be like a mother and like a woman in this like time and sort of like mythology, and it really gives like this humanity to this character that you wouldn't otherwise really think about too much, I would say. And she just has this like really stunning life. She has so much that she does when she's younger before she even gets to the events of the Ramayana as well. And I think I also really personally loved like just seeing different characters from the epic sort of pop up and show up and how they were also shown in a new light. And so some of the like traditionally good characters were shown to be a little bit more complicated, and then some of the bad characters were shown to be a little bit more layered than you originally thought. I think regardless of whether you know the mythology, Vaishnavi Patel does a really good job of like explaining small little stories from the epic, but also making this seem like its own like standalone story. I feel like she just weaves such a beautiful tale, I feel like, and I was so invested in Kaikeyi's like life and the trajectory of where it was going. This book also has a very strong like feminist element to it, and also has a really interesting examination into what it means to be a mother as well. Kaikeyi herself is like a character who really cares about other women and wants to do the best for other women, and that was just such an endearing quality that I absolutely loved, and is one of the reasons reasons why I love this book so much and why it's like one of my new favorites, because it not only was like a really enjoyable read, but it was also one that like was very impactful. I think some of the themes that are explored in this book are just so interesting and can lead to some really productive conversations as well that I just absolutely loved. And it also like sort of delves into the idea of like unchecked misogyny and like patriarchal notions and how that can be really harmful. And that was also super, super interesting. I think the way that she sort of painted Ram in this book was really interesting because he is like traditionally like the good character and like the hero of the epic, but even in the epic itself he does some questionable things, especially towards the end, if anyone sort of knows the mythology and like the epic itself. And so seeing how she took an interesting spin on this, I just absolutely loved it. The book also has like a slightly more magical tone to it, I would say. The mythology has like the demons and the gods and supernatural stuff going on regardless, but I think she added an extra element, which was really cool. Overall, this was just such a fantastic read and I cannot recommend it enough. I definitely think this is like one of those books that should be on every shelf and that so many people will come to enjoy, and I want it to just blow up as hard as Circe has. So please go pick it up. I will leave the pre-order link down below so you can all go grab it and pre-order it early, because I just think it's going to be just a knockout for so many of you, and I just want everyone to join in my love for it. So yeah, I've become an official like stan account for this book on Twitter, so go check me out there too. But love this so, so much and just cannot wait for more of you to experience it. Alrighty, the next book that I read in January was The Secret Keeper of Jaipur by Alka Joshi. So for those of you who have been watching my channel for a little bit, you may remember that The Henna Artist by this author was one of my favorite books of 2020, I believe. That one was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and I picked it up and absolutely fell in love with it. I absolutely love the main character Lakshmi and sort of her journey. She's basically this woman who flees like an abusive marriage and goes to Jaipur and becomes a henna artist for these like wealthy women in Jaipur. And she ends up getting like embroiled in their gossip and like the drama and everything. And it was just a fantastic book because I think Lakshmi as a character was just so endearing, and she's just such a like independent, strong character. And so I really loved that book. And so this book was sort of marketed as like a companion to the original book, following a side character from the first book, and that's Malik. He's like 10 years old in the first book, and this book is set 10 years later, so he's like much older. He's a young man and he's in Jaipur and doing his own sort of thing. And I don't want to spoil too much about this because I feel like it'll spoil The Henna Artist if you haven't read that. But basically I had expected this to be more about Malik, but it ended up being more like a sequel to The Henna Artist. And Lakshmi is actually like a big part of this book as well. She's like a main character. She is a POV character for this book as well. Same with Malik, but then there's also a third character who also has a perspective in this book, which I wasn't really expecting, and I don't think I really enjoyed either. This book was definitely more of a like 3-star, I would say, read. Henna Artist was definitely like a 5-star for me, but this one was definitely like more of like a 2.53. I felt like it was just a bit of an unnecessary sequel. While I did love the parts with Malik and I thought it was interesting, I felt like the stakes were just so much lower in this book compared to The Henna Artist. I remember when I was reading The Henna Artist, like by the time I was getting to the climax, I was so worried for the characters and I just needed to know what was going to happen, and I was just so invested. But this one I was just like, okay, are we getting to the point at any point? So yeah, I felt like it was like also slow to start, and I didn't really love the third character's perspective as well. I felt like she was just not completely necessary to the story, but interestingly enough, all three of their perspectives sort of connect in an interesting way, and all three of them are sort of uncovering different parts of sort of the mystery going on in this book. So those aspects were interesting. I just don't feel like I was as invested in this book as I was hoping to be. So that's sort of how I was feeling. I feel like if this had been like a true companion and it mainly followed Malik and like he had his own unique story going on, I feel like I might have enjoyed that a little bit more, but this is sort of what we got. So I would love to hear from any of you who have read this one and also The Henna Artist. What did you think of this one? Because I feel like I was just mainly disappointed by this one. All right, the next book that I read in January is one that I actually read for a vlog that will be going up in February. So I don't want to spoil too much about that video or like my thoughts on this book. So I'm going to keep this little review very brief and short, but that book is Bunny by Mona Awad. I have been meaning to read this book for ages. A lot of people have talked about this book before, and I've actually read the other book by this author as well. I read that in the fall of 2021, and I really, really enjoyed it. It was actually a really interesting read. It definitely wasn't like a favorite, but it was really cool. And so this one I went into expecting it to be equally weird as All's Well, but this one was like its own species of a book, which was also really exciting and fun, I think. I don't want to spoil like what exactly I thought of this, but just know that it was like an interesting read. Definitely as crazy as people talk about it to be. It definitely has like a bit of a like Alice in Wonderland type vibe, I would say, as well. So if you're looking for something like totally unhinged and with like an unreliable narrator and something that has a lot of literary references as well, this is definitely one to pick up. I feel like it could be a book that could be studied in an English class and it would just be like so much fun to unpack. Alrighty, we are on to the final book on this wrap up, and that is When We Left Cuba by Chanel Cleeton. So this is the book that I actually picked up because it's the companion novel to Next Year in Havana by the same author. And if you're unfamiliar, that book was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, but it was also our first ever Read in Color book club pick for November of 2021. So I absolutely loved it when we read it for the book club, and I know a lot of you enjoyed that one as well. And so this book actually follows a side character from that first book and sort of follows her personal journey and things going on post the events of the first book. And so in a way it is a bit of a sequel because I feel like you don't really understand the events of this book without knowing what happened in the first one. They do explain it at the beginning of the book, but still I feel like it makes sense to read the first one. But basically, for those of you who don't know, Next Year in Havana follows two timelines, but the timeline that's most relevant to this book is the one that's in the past, set in 1950s Cuba during the Cuban Revolution and all of that. And so in that book, we follow Elisa, who is like in love with this revolutionary and dealing with all of this stuff going on. And so she has a sister named Beatrice. And Beatrice is actually the main character in this book. And there are some events that happen in Next Year in Havana that I don't want to spoil that sort of affect Beatrice's life and her thought processes. And so when this book opens up, she and her family have left Cuba, and Beatrice is sort of like very angry and upset and really wants to return to Cuba at some point. She wants to see her home again. And so she is sort of living in this limbo and unable to move on. And she ends up getting this opportunity to work with the CIA. And the basic premise of this book is that she works with the CIA and is intending to travel back to Cuba at some point and assassinate Fidel Castro using her feminine charms. And while that was like the main premise that I thought this book was going to be focused on, it actually takes like a much broader approach. I feel like the whole assassinating Fidel Castro plotline is actually a much smaller part. A lot of this involves like Beatrice like being a spy for the CIA and her own family things going on. And there's also a romance involved in this book as well that was really interesting. I didn't really care for it at the beginning, but as the book progressed on, I really started to care for their relationship, especially by the end, partly because they have such differing views on things, which I think made for really interesting conversations in this book. But the general political plotline going on in this book is actually very heavily involved with like the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the JFK assassination. And so all these different historical events actually occur in this book, which is really cool from like a historical perspective. If you like historical fictions that touch on like specific historical events and stuff, bring them into like this fictional story. So I really enjoyed all of that, both like the political and historical aspects of this book, but also like Beatrice as a character and like the romance and everything. Honestly, this was just such a great book. I think I enjoyed it almost as much, if not more, than Next Year in Havana. I just really love Beatrice as a character also, and I think she's just a little bit more easy to root for than the characters in Next Year in Havana as well. And I like the romance a little bit better in this one too. I just love seeing how the author wove this like fictional story of this one woman into all of these like historical events and how she had an effect on all of these like major things. It was just very cool. So yeah, loved it. I would love to see this adapted into a movie though. Like that is my biggest wish after reading this, because I was like, I can imagine it and it would just be fantastic. So yeah. Loved it so much. Definitely like a 5-star read. It's definitely like a new favorite. I can probably see this going on like my top 10 books of 2022 video, along with like Kaikeyi and maybe even Six Crimson Cranes. So overall, this was a really fantastic reading month. I think I just blew my TBR out of the park. I did have like 3-ish books, 3 or 4-ish books left on my TBR, but it was ambitious to begin with. And I'm quite proud of myself for reading these 7 books. I think 5 of them were on my TBR and then 2 of them weren't. So overall, quite good progress on my TBR, I think, for this month. I'm excited to see what I'll end up reading in February, but I would love to hear from all of you what you thought of any of these books that I've read in January, and also what you read in January and what you thought of those books. I always love hearing your recommendations and also hearing your like differing or agreeing thoughts to mine. So definitely let me know what you guys thought of these books down below, because I just love discussing as usual. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, go check out my Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, and TikTok in the description down below, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!